Well, we're getting close to the end of Biological Sciences 1. So we're going to be talking a little bit about evolution. We have another chapter on populations and all of that. To me, it's like the fun part of biology is over, okay? In the next couple of chapters, there's going to be terms to memorize. I'm sorry, there's no way around it. I tell my students in face-to-face classes, hey, this is in the syllabus, you just have to know it, okay? That doesn't necessarily mean that's going to be boring, because you're familiar that there's a lot of people who disagree when it comes to evolution. The textbook only gives you one side of the story. What I like to do, and it's going to take the first and the third video in this series, is tell you, yes, this is what they say, but there's also some other observations that don't match the theory of evolution. I'm not going to tell you which one is right and which one is wrong. It's up to you which one you want to believe, okay? But I really think that you should see both sides of the controversy and then make up your mind, make an educated guess, not just what my mama said or what my textbook says or what this friend says. No, you're going to see the evidence in favor and against evolution and decide whatever you think is correct, okay? I think that's scientific honesty. But we are going to have to cover everything that's supposed to be in the syllabus because we're taking biology, okay? Like I said, the third video in this series is going to be something that is not in any book, but I really think it's important that you see both sides of the controversy, and it makes it interesting. This is when we have the most fun in class, because usually that's when the students start saying, well, I heard this, and they get into discussions in class. I love it. The more the students talk in class and the more questions they ask, the more fun we have, okay? But we are going to have to do the introduction that's less fun. So we talked at the beginning about the diversity of life on Earth, and here you have examples of that. And we say that this is the result of evolution because organisms are adapting themselves to different environments and all that. Let's leave it for the time being, okay? So we say evolution actually was a change actually in allele frequencies. Your book calls it a genetic change in the population over many generations. If you leave it just like that, I can't agree or disagree with that. Yes, you see genetic change, but what's causing the genetic change? Is it a random process? Is it adaptation? It's much better to split evolution into two different levels, macroevolution and micro and macro. I want to make sure you understand. Macroevolution is a change in allele frequencies in particular species. Remember the example, we'll go back to the moths, the dark moths and the white moths and all of that. This is a fact. It has been observed over and over and over, okay? And nobody argues with that. On the other hand, macroevolution is talking at a larger scale, how, for instance, green algae eventually became plants. You're changing one species into another species, very different, okay? Why the dinosaurs disappeared in a mass extinction, why you begin with one species and you can get a bunch of different species. That's where the argument about evolution appears, okay? So when people ask me, do you believe in evolution? The first thing I ask them is, okay, you talk about macroevolution, macro, are you talking about creation of different species? Because I will agree to many things, but not to everything, okay? The first person to worry about evolution was this Frenchman Lamarck, and he said that a particular individual may suffer modifications caused either by the environment or by the use or lack of use of something, and that was inherited by the offspring. The example he used was giraffes. He said, oh, a long time ago, giraffes had short necks, and they wanted to eat the leaves on the tree, and they couldn't reach. So the giraffe was stretching the neck, and maybe the neck grew a teeny little bit. So the next generation had a slightly longer neck, and it could reach the bottom of the leaves, and it kept stretching. So the next generation had an even, and that continued until we got to modern-day giraffes. The only problem is that we have skeletons of giraffes, fossils. The giraffes have always had long necks. Okay? An example I like to tell my students is boxers. I'm not talking about the people boxing, but the dogs. Boxers have long tails, but the AKC says a proper boxer has to have pointy ears, and by the way, a regular boxer has flappy ears, and a short tail. So every boxer puppy, and boxers have been described by the AKC for a couple hundred years now, but every puppy is born with flappy ears and long tails. And within a week, 10 days of birth, you take them to the vet, and the vet actually cuts the ears in the right shape and docks a tail. But those puppies eventually grow up, have puppies, and the puppies have flappy ears and long tails. And you keep cutting them, and you do that for, like I said, a couple hundred years. And guess what? They're still born just like the original boxers. Okay? Changes that are not in the DNA, they're not passed from one generation to the other, regardless of what Lamarck said. He called his theory the inheritance of acquired traits, and it was discredited very quickly. Like I said, there was never giraffes with short necks, just like you don't have boxers born with pointy ears. End of the story. Okay? It was a good attempt, but it didn't work. Darwin, and by the way, I was surprised to find out that Darwin all he had was a BA in science. But anyhow, everybody knows he got in the Beagle. He was a naturalist in that ship, and they went around the world. And he was supposed to be recording, collecting examples and recording what he saw. So you can see in there that they came, follow down the coast of Africa, South America, went through the Strait of Magellan, they come up South Africa until they go to the Galapagos Islands. Up until this point, Darwin has written things, and he has supported the idea that the species has remained unchanged since the time of creation. Remember, this is a time when people in Europe were extremely religious, everybody believed the Bible, so he said that species have remained unchanged since the time of creation. But he got to the Galapagos, and it was an eye-opener for him. Okay? There was many species that he went absolutely bananas describing, but we're going to focus on a particular example, the finches. He saw that there was many differences in beak shape among the finches. What this book doesn't tell you is that the Galapagos Islands is an archipelago. Okay, there's several islands. Every species was in a different island, and every species ate different food. So what he suggested was maybe there was an ancestral finch that had flown all the way from South America. Remember, they're not very far. Here you have the coast of South America, they have the islands. So maybe a finch flew all the way in there. And when they spread out throughout the islands, the beak adapted to a particular kind of food. Dependencies were big or small, they were dry or they were fleshy. The beak changed. So that's why you ended up with different beaks, different species of finch. If he had stopped there, that would have been a very good idea. But the problem is, like I said, nothing like gain attention for you to start running your mouth way too much. This wasn't the only example. He saw many examples. So he came to propose a new process by which a species change. He wrote the book on the origin of a species. And he tried to explain how evolution by natural selection is responsible for the diversity of life and the unity, the similarities. Because remember, when we talk about life, there were certain characteristics that all living organisms have. Like I said, the problem is, I think he went too far. Maybe he got the big head, but he came to a conclusion that all living organisms have a common ancestor. That's exactly the opposite of what he believed. Remember, before the trip, he said all living organisms have remained unchanged since creation. Now he's saying, oh no, there was one common ancestor that started changing and changing and changing, and everything came out of that. The other thing that many books say, and fully disagree with is that evolution is one of the unifying theories of biology. When you consider that a very large number of scientists do not believe in evolution, I don't call that unifying. It's actually very divisive. Okay? But we're just going to, in this video, study evolution. Then, like I said, we have still another video talking about population and all of that. And then I'm going to have a third video that's going to show you the flaws that are in the theory of evolution and offer you an alternative. And like I said, it's not up to me to convince you that Darwin was right or Darwin was wrong. I just want you to see, because one thing that drives me crazy, remember the scientific method. You have a hypothesis, but if the evidence, whether experimental or observations, contradict the hypothesis, you assume the hypothesis was wrong, and you change it. If you look at my chemistry videos, the atomic theory, I began with the Greeks, and I went slowly. Okay, so this is the new theory. Now this person comes up with an experiment that contradicts this, so we modify the theory, and I went all the way showing how the theory was modified until we got to the one that we believe today with quantum mechanics. I could do the same thing with the cell, where people thought about the cell, and how, as we discover more and more things about the cell theory kept changing. But for some reason, evolution, you find evidence that doesn't match with what Darwin said, and people say, so what? What's special about evolution? To begin with, evolution is a hypothesis that has been proven wrong. It's a theory. Remember when we talk about theory? Theories are based on experimental evidence, so they're going to change. Laws don't change. Evolution is not a law. It's not like gravity. So my question is, why haven't people tried to change the theory of evolution? And the fact is, they have tried to make changes, and the fact is, it's not politically correct, and it's a big controversy. Okay? And the best I can do is show you both sides of the controversy and let you make up your mind. Darwin's point was natural selection and descent with modification. He said the environment has limited resources. Okay? So it controls the size of populations. Let's assume that there's a limited amount of food for the finches. There's variation within the population. So some finches have a particular shape of beak and other ones have another one. The finch, the population that has the ideal beak for that particular food that's the most common, are going to have an advantage. We call it an adaptive advantage because they eat more, so they reproduce more. If they reproduce more, whatever gene was responsible for that beak is going to be passed to the offspring. That's what they call descent with modification. This is not like Lamarck, because Lamarck changes, like cutting the ears on a boxer, are not represented in the DNA. These are mutations that were present in the DNA, or rather different alleles of a gene, and the population that reproduces the most is going to pass those genes. So they're going to be better represented in the next generation. So that particular advantage will increase in a given population. Like I say, up until now, I agree with Darwin 100%. Okay? This is the example that we saw at the beginning, in one of the earliest videos. England, in the 1800s, there was originally two color modes. Remember we talked about that? There were dark modes, light color modes. The trees were covered with light color lichen. So look at the second picture. I can see the dark moth, but I cannot see the light one. And I promise, it's in there. But you cannot see it. So if you're a bird looking for a moth to eat, which one do you eat? The one that you see or the one that you don't see? So obviously you eat the one that you see. So there were more light color moths than dark color. Now the Industrial Revolution began, and there's a lot of soot and smoke and pollution. The bark of the trees changed to dark. Once again, you have a dark moth and a light color moth. If you was a bird, which one do you eat? The light color, because that's the one you see, right? You don't see the dark color. So the ratio of population increased before the Industrial Revolution, there was more light color. After the Industrial Revolution, there was more dark color. And after the past anti-pollution laws, it reversed again, where there was more light color again. But all you changed was the numbers, the ratio. There were more of this than that. Okay? You didn't create a new species. They're still modes, they're the same modes. The only thing that you're changing is the ratio. The ones that are better adapted survive and pass on that alleles to the offspring. So these are the evidences that most people offer to prove the evolution is right. And we're going to go through all of this. They're going to be looking at fossils, paleontology, radiometric dating, homologous body structures, vestigial structures, embryology, and similarities in macromolecules. So let's look at all of them and see what they were trying to prove. Do you know what a fossil is? It's a plant or an animal that lived a long time ago and has become rock-like, has become fossilized. And they say if you don't disturb them, the oldest ones are in the deepest layers. Okay? Unfortunately, layers in the earth are not always left undisturbed. Sometimes tectonic forces cause a particular part of the earth to actually flip completely. So the newest layers are at the bottom and the oldest layers are at the top. But even then, scientists will tell, it doesn't matter. We can explain what the layers will flip, and you still see the order. It's backwards, but they still keep the proper order. So for instance, and this is obviously not a real organism, but let's say that at the beginning it looked like a pentagon. Then it grew a little star in the middle. Then it started growing some short arms on the outside, and then the arms grew longer. When you look at the fossils, the order layers are going to have the pentagon, and as you move upwards, you get to the newer fossils. Or like I say, if something went wrong, they may be upside down, but again, this keep the order. Okay? This is an evidence of the Cambrian explosion, although it doesn't explain it. The Cambrian was a very important stage in Earth development because before that time, there was just a very limited number of species, very, very few. And then all of a sudden, a tremendous number of species appeared. That's what's called the Cambrian explosion. You went from a very limited number to an unbelievable number of species, and you can see that in the fossils. You have layers where there's hardly anything, and then all of a sudden the next layer is full of all sorts of fossils, tremendous variation, not only in number, but different species. You know that fossils have been dated by isotopes. Okay? The most common ones, we use carbon-14. Keep in mind, you find carbon only in living organisms, so this is good for organic remains, plants and animals. It's good in archaeology, when you've seen artifacts created by humans and all that. Carbon-14 has a very short lifespan, so really I've said, I'm a chemist too, so 45,000 years ago, that's the best that you can measure with this, because at a certain point the reactivity of the carbon-14 is so weak, you cannot really tell it apart from background radiation. But still, carbon-14 has been used to date organic materials that are not too old. Potassium-40 has been used in rocks and supposed to be able to read up to 5 billion years. Uranium, that decays to lead, this will become very important later on, has been used again up to 5 billion years. And people say this is a perfect clock because radioactive decay is not a chemical reaction. Well, it is a nuclear reaction, okay? But because it's not a regular and normal chemical reaction, it's independent on the temperature and environmental factors, or at least that's what most people assume. My chemistry students could tell you something different about that. But this is a clock that is running, and you just have to take what the clock says. Okay? As long as you use the right technique. I had people telling me that this rock is 50 million years old. I did carbon-14 day. No, please. You cannot use carbon-14 on a rock. You cannot measure millions of years with carbon-14. But if you use the right technique, I can understand what they're saying. This is a very, very reliable clock. Then they come up with homologous body structures, meaning they have similarities, even though they look different. Look at the human arm. And you can say the upper arm has one bone, then the forearm has two bones, then your hand, where you have the wrist with a number of little short bones, and then the actual hand and the fingers are small long bones. And you can see similar patterns in a cat leg. In the dolphin, you can say, well, it doesn't look quite like it. Well, the bones are not quite as long, but you still see the one, then the two, the bunch of different ones, and the bat wing. So you see the same pattern. And people say, you see, there was a common ancestor that had this pattern of 1, 2, number of short ones, and when the organisms adapted to different environments, they made minor variations. But they still have the basic common structure that's common to all of them, so that shows that you have a common ancestor. Yeah. Vestigial structures. These are structures that serve little or no function, but that they were useful in an ancient ancestor. And they use as an example modern whales. They have pelvic bones. Okay? What, if they don't have legs, what do they have pelvic bones? Some people say, you know what? There was an ancestor that lived on Earth, had legs. And he moved back into the ocean and eventually lost the legs. But those pelvic bones remaining there, they don't have any use today, they don't have any function, but they remind us of the day when whales walk on dry land. Okay, that's the theory. And they're going to be telling you the same thing. Vestigial structures can be your appendix, your tonsils. Embryology shows you that it looks like there's a common ancestor, because when you look at the development of an embryo of many different species, they're very, very similar at the beginning, and then they start becoming more and more different as they grow up. So by the time they hatch from the egg or they're born or whatever, they're completely different animals. But in early development, they're very similar. This was an embryologist called Haeckel. He claimed to have studied all of these embryos. He claimed that he had all of the embryos preserved in his lab, and all he did was draw and show the similarities here. But it does seem to show that early on, all of the different organisms, and look at the difference between a fish and a human, and maybe let's look at a pig, they all are very similar at the beginning. And he said, that's proof that there was a common ancestor, but then during development they start separating. Of course, we are in modern ages, 21st century, so people say, let's study how about the DNA. RNA, not so much, because remember, there's many modifications, but DNA and proteins, that will tell you which animals are closely related to which, right? And the statement that have been used until just recently was that humans and chimpanzees share 98.8% of the DNA. So humans and chimps had a common ancestor. They were very, very closely related. Again, I'm going to leave that until we get to the criticism of evolution, because they didn't look at the whole genome. Okay? That's the spoiler. Some people say, well, the problem is that not changes on DNA, not all changes in DNA change the protein. Remember, when we look at the genetic code, sometimes you could have 3 codons that actually code for the same amino acid. So you could have changes in DNA that don't change the protein. So maybe it would be better to study protein sequences. Okay? So they compare hemoglobin between human and chimps, And they found that there was no difference in the amino acids. Gorillas that are a bit supposedly further apart from humans, there was only one amino acid difference. Well, what if you compare to something that's very different from humans, with a frog? There were 67 amino acids. So it seems that the amino acid sequence of a protein tells you how closely related some organisms are, and once again led to this proves evolution. The frogs and the primates separated a long time ago, and then the gorillas separated from the chimps. So it seems like looking at macromolecules matches the theory of evolution. Okay? This is not complicated, but if you have comments, questions, anything like that, remember there's a link to my Washington account in the video description, and I'll be glad to meet with you.